What the scariest real-life story you have? Story 1, I lived in a very small town where everyone knew everyone. We had a post office, a gas station, and maybe around 200 people lived there, even now. I was around 11 or 12 years old when this happened, and it still freaks me out to this day. My cousin lived deeper in the country, and we would always visit him and my aunt. We practically lived in the woods and played on the dirt road all the time. My older cousin and his family lived further down the road and would always have sketchy people coming around there. Me, my cousin, who was probably around 14 but very tall, and my younger sister, who was maybe 8, were down the road from where my cousin lived, and there was a ditch with a creek running through it under the road. It was very grassy and definitely not safe to go into, so my cousin went first to check it out. I have always been a paranoid person, even as a child, so I stayed up top watching the road to make sure no one was coming. My cousin found some stuff down there and started looking through it when I saw a truck speed past us, then stop and start reversing very quickly. I yelled for my cousin to come up immediately. There were 2 guys in the truck, and the driver asked what we were doing down there by ourselves, which was the first red flag. I said we were just exploring with our cousin. He then said he had only seen my little sister and thought she might be in trouble and alone, and that he did not see my cousin. He kept asking me questions about who my parents were and saying it was not safe to be down there alone. While he was asking me questions, I kept yelling my cousin's name because the guy in the passenger seat got out of the truck and started grabbing something from the back before walking around the truck. At that point, I was looking for the fastest way out or something to defend ourselves. My cousin finally climbed out of the creek and stood up asking what was going on. When they realized there was a tall boy with us and not just small kids, the passenger put whatever he had back in the truck and got back inside. The driver asked my cousin the same questions, then said he would let us go. I still wonder what would have happened if my cousin had stayed down in the creek or if he had not been with us at all. A couple of months later, I came home from school alone because my sisters were in the afternoon program. I rode the bus home and waited by myself until my parents got off work. Because I was paranoid, I sat on the couch in front of the living room window with the phone next to me and the television on mute so I could hear if someone pulled up. I heard a vehicle in the driveway and peeked out the window and saw the same guys from before. I immediately went to the back bedroom, locked the door, and called my cousin who lived nearby. She said she was coming. While I waited, they walked around my house, around my dad's shed, and then sat on the porch without knocking. I stayed as quiet as possible and prayed they would leave. They eventually walked around one last time, got back in their truck, and drove off. My cousin came, checked everything, and I left with her. My dad knew most people in town, but when I described them to him, he had no idea who they were. I never saw them again, and they never came back. Story 2. I experienced this in late 2015 or early 2016. I was at a friend's house. My friends and I always hung out in the spare room near the stairs on the second floor. One day after duty, since we were student nurses at the time, we went to my friend's house to relax. There were 4 of us in the spare room, and I was looking for my friend who owned the house so we could order food. She was tall, had fairly pale skin, and long, straight hair that reached her waist. I left the room and walked toward the stairs, about to call out to her, thinking she was feeding her cats downstairs. I noticed her standing at the bottom of the stairs, not looking up. I called her name several times, but she did not respond. I became frustrated and a little terrified. I could only see the top of her head, and I was sure it was her because she was wearing a long white camisole that we usually wore under our duty uniforms. A few more seconds passed and she still did not move, so I gave up and turned back toward the spare room. Just then, a door across the hall opened and stopped me. My friend stepped out, looked around, and saw me. She asked why I was calling her instead of coming to her room. I panicked and looked back down the stairs, and there was no one there. I stood frozen until my friend came closer and casually asked if I had seen the white lady. I stared at her, unable to speak, while she laughed and said not to worry because the figure was harmless. She then went back to the spare room. Her dog, which had been in her room the whole time, ran down the stairs and started playing with the cats. Or at least, I hope it was the cats. I never went back to that house again, but we are still friends. Story 3. When I was younger, I went to my grandmother's house quite often, maybe every other weekend. This story happened when I was around 7 years old. For context, my stepbrother, who was 8, my half-sister, who was 6, and my cousin, who was 7, were all there with me. We went to sleep around 9 in the evening because we were young children and my grandparents wanted to rest. The four of us slept in the living room, with me and my brother on the two couches and my sister and cousin on an air mattress on the floor. Around 2 in the morning, since there was a digital clock in the living room, I woke up to use the bathroom. When I came back into the living room, I was about to lie down when I looked out the window and saw a man standing in the gravel driveway. I walked closer and looked carefully, trying not to let him see me. I did not recognize him as an uncle or even as my dad. Completely freaked out, I ran over and woke my brother, which was unusual because I was not easily scared as a kid. He looked out the window and immediately panicked too. He told me to check if the front door was locked while he used the house phone to call the police. After calling, we woke our grandparents, who were also alarmed. About 10 minutes later, the police arrived and arrested the man. We later found out he was wanted by local police for kidnapping and killing two children who were 7 and 5 years old. Story 4. I used to have a very emotionally and mentally abusive stepfather, and when I was in 6th grade, my mom finally decided to leave him. Thankfully, my sister and I never had to visit him because he never signed any adoption papers for us, and we did not want to see him anyway. The summer between 6th and 7th grade started off fine, but quickly went downhill. My mom found out he had a girlfriend who used substances, and she refused to even give us the option of visiting him, which was completely understandable. One night, my sister and I were at home when our ex-stepfather called her. He said he needed to see us, that he was coming over in 10 minutes, and that he did not care if our mom refused to let him in because he would force his way in if he had to. He even threatened to take us just to see us. We were terrified. My sister handed the phone to our mom, who became furious, yelled at him, and thankfully he did not show up that night. Throughout the summer, he continued showing up at our house when we were not home and tried repeatedly to contact us. Eventually, my mom had enough and wrote a cease and desist letter, warning him that she would take him to court for harassment if he did not stop. That only slowed him down temporarily. I was constantly afraid I would be taken, and I was even scared to go out in public because he rented an apartment near our home. I was 12 years old, struggling with fear, depression, and anxiety. Years have passed since then, and I have not heard from him. He finally left our family alone. He still lives in the same city, but I am no longer afraid. What I feel now is anger instead of fear, because I know he can no longer hurt me, and I have learned that showing strength and refusing to be afraid takes away the power of someone who tries to control you emotionally or mentally. Story 5. This took place in Kumanovo, Macedonia, in 2015. I was 10 years old at the time, and we were preparing to celebrate my older brother's birthday since he was turning 14. Everything was going well as we decorated for the party with lights and decorations. After some time passed, my friend and I went out riding our bikes and ended up in an area of the city called Divo Naselja, which is known for having a high crime rate. We parked near a small market to buy water when suddenly we heard gunshots outside along with police sirens. My ears were ringing as the cashier quickly pressed the alarm button. My friend and I were terrified and crying while waiting inside the store. The workers pulled down the metal security bars and closed the shop, then hid us in the storage room. We could hear ambulances outside and saw injured people being taken away. The cashier tried to calm us down and stop us from crying. When things quieted slightly, I peeked through the storage room door and heard a man screaming that he had been shot and begging for mercy, which made me close the door again. My mom called to check if I was safe, and when I explained what was happening, she panicked but told me to stay calm and wait for the police to escort us. Hours passed and it felt endless as gunshots continued for what felt like forever. I tried to stay calm but felt like I was losing my sanity. At one point, I was so scared that I called my mom and brother and told them that if I did not come back, I loved them. After about 15 hours, the gunfire finally stopped. We waited another hour, then left the building, and soon a special police vehicle picked us up, escorted us home, and tried to calm us down. Even now, I remember it as a deeply traumatic experience from my childhood. Story 6. When I was still in my mom's womb, about 5 to 6 months into her pregnancy, my dad planned to kill her because she lied about going to a rock concert with her sister. He was so angry that he camped outside my grandpa's house with a shotgun resting in his lap for 3 days, until he finally fell asleep long enough for my mom to sneak into the backyard and climb through her bedroom window. He later woke up and called her from a payphone, threatening that if she did not get into his truck, he would kill her grandparents, who were parked outside in a van while visiting for Christmas. My mom was terrified and crying, but out of fear for her grandparents' lives, she got into his truck. He drove her toward Riverside, where he was working construction on the hillside near the eastbound 91 freeway, installing large drainage pipes. He knew exactly where he planned to bury our bodies. Luckily, a security guard stopped him and firmly told him that he was not allowed back on the worksite that day and needed to leave. My dad turned the truck around and dropped my mom off at a gas station near Green River Road in the freeway. She later said it was the most afraid she had ever been, especially because of how quickly his mood could turn deadly. About 26 years later, after several days of heavy rain, part of that same hillside collapsed into the freeway, causing a massive mudslide that blocked all lanes of traffic. That was when I realized no one would ever have found our bodies if he had killed her and buried us there. I am alive today because of that security guard's refusal to let him onto the site. Story 7. Last year, after ending a marriage of 25 years because my ex-wife was cheating on me, I reconnected with my junior high school sweetheart, Carmela, who I believe later had people attempt to put me 6 feet under. After my divorce, I ran into her by accident, and around the same time I met a guy who was involved in gang activity in Los Angeles. He told me he knew one of my close friends and that things were happening that should not have been happening. I handled it because I did not want anyone from the neighborhood blamed, but she knew about it because she was putting her family in danger and still continued to be deceptive. For 4 years that I was with her, she was seeing another man behind my back, having him come over while I was at work. Her kids never told me, and it felt humiliating. Toward the end of the year, when I received a settlement from an injury, she convinced me to buy a motorcycle so she, her grandchild, and I could travel, while I worked on fixing up a motorhome. Around that time, police started bothering me, and people near the liquor store where she lived were disrespecting me. She did nothing to defend me, and her behavior became strange and distant. One day the police told me I had to move the motor home, and while I rushed to fix the wiring, she refused to help, ignored my calls, and disappeared for hours. I later discovered she had been cheating openly, even in abandoned houses and public places. About 2 weeks later, someone fired shots at the motorhome. Witnesses described a woman in pink pajama pants driving a black Honda Civic, which deeply unsettled me because she owned a similar car. My mental state deteriorated, and I began having nightmares. Eventually, I attempted to take my own life by hanging myself from the motorhome, and I was unconscious for a long time before police intervened. I survived, but later realized she and someone I trusted had plotted against me, possibly to rob me. Since then, my social media accounts have been hacked, messages sent in my name, and intimidation has continued. I am still here, but I live cautiously, knowing how close I came to losing everything. Story 8. This story is not what most people would call scary, but it has stayed on my mind since it happened, and I need to get it out. When I was younger, I had a close friend who was 16 and had very poor judgment. He was completely blinded by his love for a mutual female friend who was 17, and he ended up having a child with her. He talked to me constantly about their future, their plans, their goals, and how excited and happy he was about their unborn child. When she was about 5 months pregnant, she went on a family vacation to Germany and cheated on him with the son of one of her father's friends. When she came back, she abruptly ended things with my friend, and to both of our shock, brought the guy she cheated with back home. My friend was devastated by the sudden and life-changing decision. Time went on, and our friendship continued as he talked about his plans to remain in his child's life. When the baby was born, my friend was there holding one of her legs while her new partner held the other. When the child was about 3 months old, my friend received a phone call from his ex while we were together at the skate park. She coldly told him he needed to go to the children's hospital because something had happened to their baby. We rushed to the hospital as fast as possible. When we arrived, we found the room where the child was being treated, but outside were 3 detectives, 2 investigators, and a Child Protective Services representative. They asked my friend to speak with them, and I was told to wait in the lobby. The baby had been physically abused, suffering 12 fractures, multiple bruises, and blunt force trauma to the back of her head. Investigators questioned both parents but focused heavily on my friend, using confusing questions and misinformation. After the interview, he was allowed into the room, where his ex's family immediately attacked him verbally and physically. After emotions settled, there was a long silence until the ex's mother admitted she had played with the baby too roughly several times. She was heavily dependent on pain medication for serious medical conditions, and her confession was heard by medical staff and Child Protective Services. Despite this, a case was opened against both parents and lasted 3 years, during which the child became a ward of the state. No one was ever found guilty, yet the child was returned to the mother, who then spent another 3 years in court trying to sever my friend's parental rights by accusing him of mental instability, substance abuse, and failure to protect his child. He was portrayed as a dangerous and unstable person, and as his main support, I watched the system destroy him. He is now too afraid to seek professional help for his trauma because he fears it will be documented and used against him. He barely communicates, isolates himself, and says he copes by making music that I have never heard. Watching him slowly disconnect from reality just to survive has been one of the hardest things I have ever witnessed. Story 9. I was around 13 or 14 when my family went to the county fair on an extremely crowded day, the kind where you constantly have to keep track of everyone you are with. We were near the kiddie rides when my aunt and dad started arguing over something stupid, and the distraction was enough for everything to feel chaotic. Suddenly, my mom grabbed my hand and told me to follow her immediately. She dragged me through the crowd without explaining anything and stopped in front of an older man who looked to be in his 60s. He was holding the hand of a crying little boy who looked about 5. My mom demanded to know what he was doing with the child, and the man froze before claiming he was the boy's grandfather and that they were looking for the boy's mother. My mom knelt down and asked the child if he knew the man. The boy shook his head and said they were trying to find his mommy. He pointed at the man and said he told him she was in the parking lot. I felt a wave of fear when I saw the man staring at the boy and quickly licking his top lip. My mom tightened her grip on my hand, took the boy's hand, and told him that we would help him find his mom, but that she was not in the parking lot. She told him they would go back to where he last saw her and get a police officer to help. The boy looked confused and glanced at the man, repeating that she was in the parking lot. My mom yelled at the man to let go of the child. He glared at her before releasing him. She picked the boy up, asked where he last saw his mom, and he pointed toward the ride entrance. When we turned back, the man was gone. We found a security officer who radioed that the boy had been found. Moments later, a frantic woman ran toward us holding 2 young twins and collapsed to hug her son, sobbing and thanking my mother. She explained she was a single mother and had promised to wait for him at the ride exit, but got distracted when one of the twins started crying. Only moments had passed before she realized her son was gone. The officer thanked my mom, who was crying as well, and we returned to my family who had been worried. My mom explained that despite the noise and chaos, she had heard a faint cry for his mother and felt something was wrong. We went home after that and have never returned to the fair in over 12 years. The image of that man licking his lips still haunts me, and the fact that he disappeared into the crowd still haunts my mother. Story 10. I was walking home from a high school lock-in at around 6 or 7 in the morning on a Saturday with my best friend. It had rained most of the night, it was winter, and everything was covered in about an inch of ice, making every surface dangerously slippery. We were walking along the side of the street because the sidewalks were impossible to use, since they had not been shoveled before the freezing rain and had deep tracks covered by solid ice that would twist your ankles if you stepped on them. We were going uphill along the road, and from the opposite side there was a short stretch where traffic briefly disappeared from view. Suddenly I heard a horn and looked up to see a car full of people we knew from school. They were screaming and waving, and for a split second we thought they were just messing around and driving recklessly. But then I realized what they already knew, that they were going to hit us and there was nothing they could do to stop it because they were going way too fast and completely out of control. I grabbed my friend and jumped as far as I could, holding on to him as tightly as possible. But when he was hit, it spun me around, and I watched it happen. I will never forget the sound, that sharp crack. I ran to where he landed, and he was still awake, barely aware of what was going on. I could see at least 2 compound fractures, and it was obvious he had hit his head hard. We both thought he was going to make it, and he asked me to find his glasses, saying his head hurt. I turned around looking for them and then noticed the car was far down in the ditch. At the same time, I saw two power poles swaying by the wires, about to fall. One snapped and somehow did not land on me, but it fell between me and my friend, so I could not get back to him. Someone grabbed me and put me into an ambulance. They gave me something that knocked me out, and when I woke up, my friend was gone. I miss him all the time. I still wish I could have traded places with him or that the car had hit both of us. This happened decades ago, and even now I can still hear that sound and see the way his body bent and flew through the air like a rag doll. Story 11. Back in 2011, my parents had just bought a small farm in the middle of nowhere. My dad was still working in California, so it was just my mom and me living in the new house. The house sat at the end of a dead-end gravel road with no homes beyond it, surrounded by heavy woods, and moving from a city to that kind of isolation was unsettling. It was our first week there, and the house needed a lot of work, so we had been going to bed early. One night, sometime after 10 in the evening, there was a knock at the door. For context, we had an Australian shepherd that looked like a Rottweiler and was very aggressive with strangers. And to reach the front door, you had to pull into a private drive and walk through a closed, gated deck, so it was not inviting at all. The knock sent the dog into a frenzy, and both my mom and I got up, already uneasy because it was pitch black outside and we were alone. My mom grabbed her handgun and hid it behind her back while opening the door, and I struggled to hold the dog back. The man at the door claimed to be our neighbor and said he wanted to welcome us, which felt strange at that hour. My mom thanked him and tried to end the conversation, but he stopped her from closing the door. The dog was going crazy and I could barely control her. The man started saying he owned part of our land and that the well on the property belonged to him, along with other bizarre claims. My mom told him to leave, but he refused. She then pulled out her gun and calmly told him to leave immediately or she would shoot and release the dog. He started yelling and ran off the deck, down the driveway and toward his truck. Only then did we realize he was not alone when he shouted that the woman had a gun. My mom locked the door and I called the police as they drove away. By sheer luck, a deputy was already nearby and stopped the man before he left the private road, issuing him a trespass warning. It was one of the scariest moments of my life, but my mom stayed calm and ready to protect us. He did turn out to be a neighbor, owning the empty lot next to ours where he occasionally camped when passing through the area. Story 12. This is not my story, but my husband's, and some details are a little fuzzy because I do not want to ask him to relive it. It was early spring when farmers were preparing their fields after winter. In our town, farmers are allowed burning permits to clear debris, while residential lots are not, so every year there are countless complaints called in about fires. Most of the time it is neighbors reporting each other or calling in farmers who are actually allowed to burn. On this particular day, it was sunny and perfect for burning, but for some reason both trucks were busy. One property kept getting reported, a farm next to a new housing development where the backyards overlooked the fields. Neither truck nor fire prevention made it a priority at first, since the man was known to be permitted, and usually they just checked and left. Eventually they had time to drive out, mostly hoping that whoever kept calling would see them and stop reporting it. They parked and walked across the field toward a quad and the farmer. As they approached, they called out greetings but got no response. At first they thought maybe he could not hear them. As they got closer, they noticed he was kneeling and still not turning around. Then they realized what had happened. The man had been burned by his own fire. Two responders ran to him while another ran back to the truck for equipment and called for an ambulance. The farmer was over 90 years old and had been burning long grass when he fell and could not get back up. The fire surrounded him, catching his clothes and skin on fire as he knelt there. Nearly all of his clothes and most of his skin were burned, with only his hat and hair spared. Living alone, he had stayed there in the field, trapped in his burned body, hoping someone would find him. My husband said he was incredibly kind despite the unimaginable pain and did not even complain when they moved him. The man died a few days later. It was one of the hardest calls my husband has ever attended, partly because it never came in as an emergency and there was nothing through dispatch to prepare them for finding a victim, and partly because of the constant what-ifs about how different things might have been if they had arrived sooner. Story 13. I once heard this story from my parents about a mother they knew who had moved into a brand new housing development. She and her husband had twin daughters who were around 4 or 5 years old. The neighborhood was in that in-between stage where some families had moved in, but construction was still ongoing on houses and parks, with builders driving in and out constantly. There were no trees yet, only small saplings, no fences, and dirt everywhere. One afternoon, the mother sent the twins outside to play, and they took a large cardboard box from their new refrigerator with them. They set it up well within the front yard and played inside it, while the mother watched from the kitchen window, keeping an eye on them so they would not wander toward the active construction site across the road. A semi-trailer delivering materials to a nearby house drove down the street, mounted the curb directly in front of the home, and crushed the cardboard box with the girls inside it. The driver assumed the box was empty. Years later, the mother reportedly started a new family with a different man. That story has always stayed with me as a reminder that you cannot rely on the assumptions of strangers when it comes to what you value most, and that life can change completely in a single moment. Story 14. One of many memories I rarely think about. My uncle spent a lot of his life in prison, so two of my cousins lived with me and my mother, which basically made us siblings. One day, while waiting to be picked up from our private Christian school, a man approached us by the flagpole and told us that my mom was working late and had sent him to get us. We were young and did not question it, so we got into the car. He kidnapped us. We were taken to a warehouse and restrained in a way that forced us to watch what happened next. I was 11 years old. My cousins were 12 and 8. I know who these people were, but I cannot say. We were forced to watch as my uncle was tortured for hours, beaten and burned, while my younger cousin cried uncontrollably watching her father suffer. At the end, they told us this was a lesson and warned us not to follow his path. Then in front of us, they killed him and made sure we understood the threat. They told us that if we ever went to the police, acted like him, or failed to pay his debt, the same would happen to us, only worse. One of them cut us loose and told us to run. The three of us are extremely close because of this, even though we never talk about it, and somehow that silence feels liberating. The strangest part is that his seventh wife had taken out a multi-million-dollar life insurance policy, and the day the waiting period ended was the day this happened. She has never been seen again, nor has the money. Story 15. Maybe not the scariest, but it is completely true and happened to me and my sister. My mom was a single parent and worked her entire life as a corporate flight attendant, while my dad was not around. Because of her long trips, she needed a nanny, not because we were wealthy, but out of pure necessity. We had the same nanny since before I could remember, but eventually she became ill and told my mom she had to quit. She met my mom at a coffee shop in upstate New York and said she had already lined up a replacement named Karen, and they discussed the details publicly. A stranger overheard the conversation and later showed up at the interview pretending to be Karen. The real Karen never came. This was in the early 1990s before the internet, and the interview went well, so my mom hired her. About 5 years later, my mom ran into the original nanny at a mall and thanked her for recommending Karen. The nanny was confused and explained that her friend had moved out of state and never went to the interview, and she assumed we had hired someone else. A complete stranger had lived in our house and watched me and my sister from around 5 to 10 years old. We went on road trips with her, she had her own room, and we never met her family or friends. When my mom confronted her, she broke down crying and admitted she had been desperate for work and had grown to love us. My mom decided to let her stay, and she continued caring for us until I was old enough to watch my sister myself. Story 16. There is a book called something like Haunted Places in Wisconsin, and about 10 years ago, 4 friends and I were flipping through it and read a story about a one-lane bridge where, in the 1960s, a car carrying a prom couple supposedly went off the edge and they drowned. The book claimed that if you went there at dusk and looked into the water, you could see headlights below the surface, and sometimes the girl still wearing her dress. Being bored 20-somethings, we decided to check it out. The bridge was still there, only one lane wide, with a long, curving driveway on one side leading to a hidden mansion in the woods and farmland on the other. We parked near the field and 2 of us walked to the middle of the bridge, while the others stayed closer to the road. We were there for maybe 6 minutes, watching the sun disappear and staring into the shallow river, when I suddenly felt uneasy and heard a loud snap from the driveway side. My instincts kicked in, and I yelled for everyone to run. As I turned, headlights from a truck came speeding down the driveway, and at the same time I heard a powerful engine coming up the river from the direction of the mansion. Everyone sprinted back to the car. As I reached the road, I glanced back and saw a boat with 5 people dressed in dark clothing, climbing the embankment with flashlights and weapons, moving incredibly fast. My friends were screaming for us to jump into the car, and we dove in as they were right behind us. The driver reversed hard as the truck reached the bridge, and the people kept chasing the car without saying a word. One of them ran faster than anyone I have ever seen, like something unreal. We barely managed to turn the car around and escape. What still terrifies me is how coordinated it all felt, how quickly they moved, how silent they were, and how it seemed like we were being trapped from both sides. I still wonder if the story in that book was never meant to be a ghost story at all, but a lure. Story 17. I was driving back to school from Boise to Eugene after spring break when I picked up a hitchhiker. He was happy and friendly at first, but as the miles went by, his personality slowly shifted from easygoing to controlling and hostile. I stopped for gas and to use the bathroom, and he told me to leave the keys in the car when I got out, which immediately made me take them with me. When I went inside to pay, he followed and told the cashier to add a pack of cigarettes to my bill, and I told her I was not paying for cigarettes. Before we got back into the car, I told him he needed to find another ride. He got back in anyway and told me to shut up and drive. We drove in silence for about 50 miles before he suddenly exploded, yelling that he needed a cigarette. I told him the only way he was getting one was by finding another ride, which shut him up for a while. After we passed Salem, he became increasingly agitated and said he had to be in Los Angeles by the next day. I told him he would have no problem finding a ride once we reached Eugene. About 10 miles before the exit, he told me I was going to drive him to Los Angeles or else. About 5 miles past the Eugene exit, a state police car started to pass us, and he told me to slow down and let the officer go by. Instead, I sped up, cut in front of the police car, and started tapping my brakes. He began screaming at me to stop and let the officer pass. The police car pulled behind us and turned on its lights. My passenger was shaking and told me not to do or say anything stupid. As soon as I stopped, I grabbed my keys, jumped out, ran back to the police car, and told the officer exactly what was happening. The officer waited for backup, then removed the man from my car at gunpoint. As they walked him away, he screamed that he should have killed me earlier. A few days later, the officer called me for more details and told me the man had 3 outstanding warrants for murder. He said there was no doubt I would have been another victim if I had not done what I did to get their attention. The man was extradited to Texas and is now on death row. I had nightmares about that day for years afterward. Story 18. In 1989, a guy who lived a block from me and rode the same school bus picked up a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old girl at a video arcade in a neighboring town and offered to drive them home. He assaulted them and then killed them, placing their bodies in trash bags and dumping them over a hillside. One of the girls was likely still alive when she was dumped. Around 2011, I met a horror movie actor at an event and ended up talking to his girlfriend, who later became his wife. She had grown up nearby, and when we realized they lived only a few blocks from my parents' house, she asked me if I knew the man who committed the murders. When I said yes, she told me she had been close friends with one of the victims, and that it was pure luck she was not at the arcade that night. In 2016, my friends and I were at a convention and saw flyers announcing that the same actor would be a guest the following year. I mentioned the story to a friend who had grown up in the town where the arcade was located, and she said she could make it even stranger. In 1989, she and a friend were playing basketball in her driveway when they noticed a man in a pickup truck sitting nearby, smoking and watching them. After finishing his cigarette, he pulled up and asked if they wanted to go for a ride. They ran away. The next day, his face was on the news as the suspect accused of the double murder. Even decades later, the way all of those connections overlap still unsettles me. Story 19. There was once a 14-year-old girl whose real name I do not know. She lived with her mom and dad and had no siblings. Her parents often left for business trips that lasted 2 to 3 days and would leave her home alone. Their house was in the middle of nowhere, on a very long road where almost no one ever passed except the delivery driver. Her parents were about to leave for another trip and believed she would be fine by herself. The girl, who we will call Sophie, was familiar with the delivery driver who came by every day and would sometimes exchange a few words with him when he dropped off the mail. One day while her parents were gone, the driver arrived and handed her 2 letters in a large manila envelope with nothing on it except her name written in big red letters. He mentioned that he had seen a strange woman walking along the road and had stopped to ask if she needed help, and that she had asked if anyone lived on the road before he drove away. Sophie thought nothing of it and went back inside. When she opened the envelope, she found photographs of herself at school and a couple of her socks. She immediately called the police and her parents. They came home, and the police conducted a brief investigation but found nothing. For about a month, her parents stayed home and kept a close watch on her. When nothing else happened, they began traveling again, but hired a 21-year-old babysitter named Mindy to stay with her. Things were fine for a few days until one afternoon, the delivery driver returned and handed Sophie another identical manila envelope. Inside were photographs of her at the mall, pictures taken inside her room from under her bed, showing her feet and one of her blouses. Mindy called the police and her parents, but this time they were unable to come home right away and told them to wait it out and cooperate with the authorities. Another investigation led nowhere. On the final day of the trip, Sophie and Mindy went to the grocery store, and while waiting in line, Sophie noticed a woman who perfectly matched the description the driver had given before, with extremely pale skin, dark hair, and unnaturally thin fingers. They followed her outside and watched her get into a United Parcel Service truck. Sophie felt compelled to call the company, and when she did, she was told that no delivery driver ever went down her road and that all mail was supposed to be left at the mailbox at the top of the road. They also told her that no employee by the name she knew had ever worked for them. Story 20. When I was 10 years old, I regularly attended a choir club for children. One day, my dad picked me up instead of my mom, which confused me because she always did. But I did not think much of it at first. Halfway through the drive, my dad began mumbling about how sorry he was and how I would never see him again. Terrified and confused, I kept asking what he meant, but he refused to explain. When we arrived home, he stayed in the car and urged me to get out. Before I did, he told me that I would not see him again because he would be dead very soon for what he had done and that the police would explain everything. After he forced me out, I ran inside the apartment, only to find no one there, the door open and blood on the floor. The police arrived shortly after and explained what had happened. My dad had become obsessively jealous after finding old condoms in a cupboard and convinced himself that my mom had been unfaithful, ignoring the fact that we had recently moved in and that they could have belonged to previous tenants. He had attacked my mom in a violent rage. I was taken to the hospital where she was being treated and thankfully survived because my younger brother, who was 7 at the time, had intervened. If not for him, my dad would have killed her. When my dad said I would never see him again, he meant that he had planned to end his own life after dropping me off. He failed and was taken into psychiatric care. This remains the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I still think about my brother often, about what it meant for a child to witness something like that. And although we both carried deep trauma afterward, we somehow grew into decent people. I have never properly told him how grateful I am that he was there, but I know that I should. Story 21. When I was around 9 or 10, my family would spend every summer at my grandparents' house in the countryside. They had a large wooden house with 2 floors, and at that time they had recently installed electrical panels and artificial lighting, so the lights were usually on. One afternoon during dinner, my grandmother told me a story about a family that had died in the forest near where we lived. The family, made up of 2 parents and 2 children, had perished when their house burned down, and she said their souls still wandered the forest searching for a place to rest. My mom told me not to believe it and said it was just an old tale meant to scare children, but I believed it completely and could not stop thinking about it. When night came and it was time to sleep, I could not fall asleep, so I decided to go downstairs to get a glass of water. I was sleeping on the 2nd floor, and turning on the lights would have woken my parents, especially since the door was open, and closing it would have made a loud squeaking noise. I saw some old candles they used before electricity, but I had nothing to light them with, so I decided to go downstairs in the dark. When I got down, I noticed the front door was open, so I closed it. then went into the kitchen where the table sat in a dark corner with very little light. There I saw a dark figure standing near the table. At the time, I thought it was my grandfather, so I grabbed a glass of water, drank it, said goodnight, and went back upstairs to sleep. 1 or 2 years ago, I remembered that summer and decided to look into the story of the burned house, and I found out it was real. At first I was shocked, but then I became deeply unsettled as I remembered that night. I have never told anyone this story because it sounds like something a sleepy child might imagine, but it has stayed with me ever since. Story 22. After several years working in criminal court, I have a few disturbing experiences, but the scariest thing that ever happened to me occurred while I was working as a clerk, providing judicial information to people who had recently been released from prison. One day, a man came in who immediately caught my attention because he was extremely talkative and unusually knowledgeable about legal procedures. He spoke to me about issues with his paperwork and even helped a woman who was standing in line near him by explaining what had happened with her imprisoned husband. After I assisted her, the man turned and left the room, and the woman leaned toward me and whispered, clearly terrified, that she did not know him. She left shortly after, and I was left confused and uneasy. Over the next few days, the same man returned 2 more times because his documents were delayed and he needed them to move on with his life, to rent a place and find work. Each time, I felt something was off about him. He talked constantly, avoided direct eye contact, and always carried a plastic bag that he nervously handled while we spoke. A few weeks later, a 16-year-old girl from the town went missing. Days after that, footage was released showing her being dragged into a car by a man who turned out to be the same person I had been dealing with. The news reported that he had used a rope and a knife to kill her, and the footage showed the same items in the same plastic bag he always carried with him. I spent months shaken by the realization of how close I had been to him, and although time has dulled the memory, it is something I will never fully forget. Story 23. My dad was a pilot in the Royal Australian Air Force during the Second World War. He was shot down in flames over Ploiești, Romania. While flying that night, he saw the ghost of a close friend who was also flying on a different plane, who appeared to him and said, "It's a wicked night tonight, Skip." My dad's own father had once worked as a mining engineer at the oil fields that my dad had been sent to bomb. He bailed out with his crew, but the rear gunner, his best friend named Spud, was killed in the crash. They were captured, buried their fallen crew member, and were imprisoned in a prisoner of war camp. My dad later escaped and was repatriated 60 days later, returned to England, and married my mother. Spud had met my mother before the war and had not liked her. During their honeymoon, my mother felt extremely unsettled and was convinced that Spud's spirit was present in their hotel room. My dad laughed it off and told Spud to leave them alone, but my mother was absolutely certain that someone had been there. Trying to calm her, my dad checked the hotel records and discovered that Spud had stayed in that very room months earlier with his fiancée, Valerie. My dad tracked her down and learned that she had never been informed of Spud's death because she was not listed as his next of kin. My dad comforted her as best he could, and after that, my parents never felt Spud's presence again. However, in a photograph taken of the crew on Victory in Europe Day overlooking Piccadilly Circus, when it was later developed, there was a shadowy figure visible in the image, which they always believed was Spud. Story 24. My mother's family lived in the state of Pará in Brazil, deep in the Amazon rainforest. At the time, the city was extremely isolated, reachable only by a 4 to 6 hour boat trip, with no roads leading to it. During the rainy season, the river would overflow and flood large parts of the town, which had fewer than 10,000 people back then. Houses in the flood zones were built on thick wooden pillars and connected by suspended walkways. When the water receded, the mud below was filled with strange crabs, and when it rose, fish, river dolphins, and sometimes crocodiles and giant snakes could be seen beneath the houses. Life there was shaped by isolation, constant flooding, and deep religious beliefs that mixed Catholicism with indigenous legends and folklore. These stories could sound silly from far away, but in the middle of the rainforest at night, they felt very real. My uncle worked at the first bakery in the city and woke before sunrise every day to walk a route along the edge of town near the dense forest. Jaguars hunted in that area at night, and everyone knew it was dangerous. One morning during heavy rain, he left for work and never arrived. He was missing all day, and no trace of him was found. The next morning he returned home pale and shaken, as if something had terrified him beyond words. When asked what had happened or where he had been, he refused to say anything and became visibly distressed, eventually asking everyone to stop asking. More than 30 years have passed, and no one in the family has ever brought it up again. We all knew that the forest held dangers, both real and legendary. As my grandmother used to say before she died at 102 years old, when it is raining and you are in the forest, if you hear someone calling your name, do not answer, no matter how strong the urge feels. Story 25. One night, when I was around 4 or 5 years old, I was riding one of those small coin-operated rides they place near malls while my godparents were nearby, withdrawing money from an automatic teller machine. They were usually very protective of me, but for a brief moment, they were not paying attention. A man approached me and said in a rough voice, "Son, so this is where you have been. I have been looking for you everywhere." I was confused, but before I could react, he grabbed me and carried me toward the parking lot. I was screaming and crying loudly, but no one intervened, probably assuming I was just a child having a tantrum. A few minutes later, my godmother ran into the parking lot and yelled at the man. He claimed he had made a mistake, handed me back to her, apologized, and calmly explained himself before walking away to his car without any concern about the child he supposedly thought was lost. My godmother has always been very trusting and easily convinced by people who sound sincere. We talked about it once as a family and then buried the subject. Still, sometimes I think about where my life might have gone if he had succeeded in taking me, and that thought alone is terrifying. Story 26. The scariest thing I ever saw happened when I was about 9 years old. My father had gone out drinking the night before Easter, and I decided to sleep on the couch. At some point during the night, he came home drunk, and I remember hearing a very loud bang, but I did not move because he terrified me, so I fell back asleep. The next morning, my sister, who was 13 at the time, woke me for Easter and told me that our dad was snoring at the bottom of the stairs and would not wake up. She convinced me to help wake him. From the top of the stairs, I saw him lying there, snoring loudly. I shouted his name and got no response. We were both too scared to go down, so we called our mom, who told me to go down and put the phone next to him. As I went down the stairs, I felt that something was terribly wrong. He looked extremely pale. When I reached the bottom, I saw a large gash on his head and a massive pool of blood around him, which I was standing in. After that, my memory goes dark. My mom later told me that I calmly said he was dead and dropped the phone. He had fallen down the stairs and hit his head, and the doctors said he was brain dead from the initial impact, though his body kept functioning. He had vomited, and it filled his lungs, which caused the loud snoring sound we heard. Story 27. I grew up on the east coast of India and lived a fairly peaceful life. During my bachelor's degree, I met a girl with whom I shared many interests, and we often went on long, unplanned trips around the city, talking endlessly. One evening, we decided to watch the movie Annabelle and then look for a house to move into. While waiting for the show, it began to drizzle, which was strange because it was mid-December, a month that rarely ever sees rain. We brushed it off and watched the movie, which left us both on edge. Afterward, we noticed a man dressed entirely in black, soaked from the rain, standing a few blocks away from my car, as if he had been waiting. When he noticed us, he quickly walked away. Already shaken from the movie, we left immediately. We drove to a remote area on the other side of the city to look at cheaper apartments and found one that eerily resembled the setting of the movie, which we nervously joked about. At sunset, we headed back, but the navigation system stopped working, forcing us to rely on memory. My friend suggested taking a shorter route, though it was deserted and poorly lit. As we drove, she told me a story about Pangar Fort, a place in Rajasthan known for paranormal legends, describing how the souls of a massacred army were bound to the land centuries ago. I was already frightened when she jokingly said, "What if I shouted Pangar right now and something happened?" The moment she said it, the streetlights shut off, followed by my car headlights. The road went completely dark. We sat frozen for several minutes until I saw a car approach from behind. I stepped out to signal it with a flashlight, which turned out to be a mistake. The car stopped and a man got out. As he approached, I realized it was the same man I had seen near my car earlier. I shouted that I recognized him from the theater. He stopped and calmly said he meant no harm and would keep his distance. My friend inside the car looked pale and terrified, unable to speak. The man instructed me how to reset something near the engine. And when I followed his instructions, the headlights suddenly worked again. When I tried to thank him, he was already walking away. The streetlights came back on, and I got into the car, relieved until my friend grabbed my arm and asked who I had been talking to. She insisted there had been no one there and that she had watched me talk to myself. When I looked back, there was no car, no man, nothing. I drove away immediately, and we did not speak the entire way home. Even years later, the memory of that night still haunts both of us. Story 28. This is a story my dad told me. When I was a baby, we lived in a large apartment complex, and the room I stayed in had a closet in the corner with the door nailed shut, clearly painted over like it was meant to keep something in or out. During the day, I could be in that room without any issue, but at night I would completely lose it and had to be moved into my parents' room every time. My grandmother came over to see what was going on, and she was known in the family as someone who could sense things. My dad managed to pry the closet door open, and the moment my grandmother stepped inside, she nearly collapsed and had to be helped back out. As soon as she left the closet, she was completely fine. She described the sensation as the room spinning violently, while a heavy, evil presence pressed down on her. A few days later, my dad called someone he referred to as the Mushroom Man, who performed a cleansing of the room and the closet. It worked for a short time, but then the same thing started happening again, and I still could not stay in the room at night. My dad asked the people who ran the building who had lived there before us, and was told it had been an elderly woman with severe schizophrenia and dementia. He called the Mushroom Man again, but this time it had no effect. Eventually, my dad took a drain snake and removed every bit of hair he could find from the drains in that room. After that, everything stopped and never happened again. He also told me that when he was on the computer late at night, he would sometimes see, out of the corner of his eye, a very tall man wearing a tall hat like Abraham Lincoln, walking between rooms. And he often felt like something was watching him from the high ceiling vent and from just behind him. Story 29. I have two stories. The first is not so much scary as it is deeply disturbing. When I was in college, I worked as a cashier at a popular chain restaurant where the staff felt like a family. Everyone got along well, and we spent time together outside of work. One day, one of the cooks did not show up for his shift, which was very unlike him because he was always reliable, helpful, and friendly with customers. The next day, we learned he had been arrested after attempting to kidnap an 8-year-old girl at a school bus stop. Police later searched his apartment and found nearly 10,000 images and videos involving child exploitation. He admitted to abusing multiple young girls in that apartment. What made it worse was that he lived with a roommate who also worked with us and had no idea, and many of us had been in that apartment before to hang out, completely unaware of what was happening there. The second story is something my mom told me about a month ago. A family had their master bathroom remodeled over a 2-week period, and two of the workers carefully watched the family's routines while pretending to do their job. They secretly stole a key and made copies without anyone noticing or feeling suspicious. Once they knew when the house would be empty, they returned the day after the remodel was finished. The children were at school and the husband was at work. The wife went to shower in the newly remodeled bathroom, but due to low water pressure, she went upstairs instead. The two men entered the house, found her in the shower, assaulted her, and left her severely injured. Neighbors noticed the men fleeing and the front door left open, which led to a quick response, and the woman survived but was left with severe trauma. The family sold the house shortly after. About a year later, my parents bought that same house. I lived there for 14 years, and that shower was the one I used almost every day. My parents never told us because we were young when we moved in, and only recently shared the story after a rise in break-ins nearby reminded them of it. Knowing something so horrific happened in a place that once felt safe and familiar is deeply unsettling. Story 30. This is my own story from when I was younger and much dumber. Back then, my friend Brian and I would go to our friend Pablo's place to drink underage and hang out. Pablo lived in a 2-family house, and the downstairs neighbors always seemed normal. They partied a lot, and sometimes we would join them. The strange part was the grandmother who sat on the porch every single day. I was friendly and always said hello, but she never acknowledged me. I just assumed she was old. She never moved, just sat there for hours staring, and she honestly reminded me of the woman from The Taking of Deborah Logan. One night after drinking, the three of us headed downstairs to start our walk home. We heard something move and looked over the porch railing, and when we turned around, she was standing directly behind us. We all froze. I remember nervously saying hello and asking how she was doing. This time she responded and said something that still gives me nightmares. She asked if we could stand the sight of blood, because that night she was going to end her life in the bathroom, then laughed in a horrifying way. We ran past her as fast as we could. When I got home, I told my grandmother to call the police and explain what had happened. She told me that the people who lived downstairs had been there since my mother was my age, and that no elderly woman had ever lived there. That still messes with me to this day. I have no idea who she was or why she sat there every day. Story 31. My manager once told me about his godbrother after he came home from the military. Right after basic training, he was sent straight to Iraq, during a time when soldiers were given very direct orders with no room for questions. He came back deeply damaged and was not the same person. After returning home to Texas, he spiraled completely and became involved in substances. One night, he went to his parents' house, killed them, dismembered their bodies, brought the remains back to his own home, and tried to burn them. He told his girlfriend what he had done, and when she threatened to call the police, he tied her to the bed and set up a firearm aimed at her head with a string attached to the trigger and another tied to the doorway. He then called the police himself and told them exactly what he had done, where to find him, and repeatedly warned them not to enter through the front door or the woman would be killed. The police were already responding to reports of a horrific smell in the area, but they went through the front door anyway, and the trap was triggered. He was later convicted and sentenced to death. Before his execution, my manager spoke to him, and he said he did not feel real remorse, only that he wished someone had stopped him before he killed anyone. Story 32. I have never really shared this story, but it still gives me nightmares, and maybe talking about it helps. About 30 years ago, right after college, I worked as a temp, which meant constantly meeting new people. One coworker was an older woman from another state, missing one eye, with no prosthetic. I will call her Grace. She told me she lost her eye during a violent carjacking where she was shot and assaulted. She said her husband was in the military overseas and would be retiring after this tour. She sent him care packages, owned a large talking parrot that searched the house when she asked where he was, and spoke often about how much she missed him. She had an estranged adult daughter and frequently told me to always stay close to my family. Although she seemed odd, I assumed trauma explained it. Still, some things she said made me uneasy. One day I read a news article about a prisoner suing the state for mistreatment, and the name stuck with me. It was unusual, and the more I thought about it, the more it reminded me of Grace's husband. Around the holidays, she said he was coming home on leave, which made me think I was wrong. Later, she became increasingly stressed, started giving me gifts, and I began avoiding her. Eventually, I looked deeper into the court records and realized the inmate was a violent offender with a long history of serious crimes involving children. I had no proof at first, but working around Grace became terrifying. One day she disappeared during lunch, and when she returned, she was furious that I had not covered for her absence. She demanded I get into her car and became aggressive when I refused. Shortly after, she was fired for falsifying information. A supervisor later confirmed that her husband was not overseas and that my suspicions were correct. Years passed, and I lived in fear of both of them, even after moving and changing my name. I later learned he had been released and then eventually died, and she passed away as well. To this day, I still wonder what might have happened if I had gotten into her vehicle that afternoon.